If you recall John Carpenter's comments in Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, you remember that he told the stories about the tribes sitting around the campfire. One story said the horror is out there. It's the other, the spirits and creatures that are not human. He says that in that type of horror, the source of evil is outside of us. So far this semester, we have dealt with the horror that is out there. But Carpenter's other story replies that no, horror lies within us. He says that it is the evil within people that is the source of horror. As we begin discussing domestic horror, we are turning to a discussion of the horror within us. The source for this presentation is Gina Whisker, and complete bibliographic information for her is provided on the Works Cited page that will be posted for this class. Whisker states that domestic horror appeals to our natural need for safety. On the left of this slide, you see a hierarchy of needs that was composed by psychologist Abraham Maslow. Maslow maintains that we must fulfill the needs on each level, starting at the bottom, in order to move up that pyramid. Our most basic need, of course, are physiological needs. We must have food, water, and shelter from the elements. Those are primary. But once we are confident that we can consistently meet those needs, we turn to addressing our needs for safety. In order to feel safe, we need to feel secure in our homes and communities. We also need to feel secure about the basic nature of the people in our lives and our identity of self, of who we are and what we are capable of. Now, Whisker also says that domestic horror deals with our assumptions that if we follow society's rules, and in general we meet what is expected of us and use a little bit of common sense, we will be rewarded. At the very least, we should be able to expect to feel relatively safe if we don't violate society's expectations. At least that is the belief system that we operate under. But in domestic horror, that is not the case. People living normal lives and doing what they can to play by society's rules become victims of horror, originating in sources where they least expect it, which makes it even more horrifying. Now, Whisker maintains that domestic horror affects more than our feelings of safety in our homes and with the people in our lives. To some degree, the identity of self is both affected by and reflected in our homes and our interactions with those that we are closest to, and that both of those can have a dramatic effect on our identity of self. By defamiliarizing those places and people who are most familiar to us, domestic horror leads us to doubt our understanding of the nature of the world and life itself, and our basic understanding of it. It creates questions about the foundational knowledge that forms the basis of how we identify self. Now, one form of domestic horror deals with defamiliarizing the places that are most familiar to us and that we generally assume are safe, such as our homes, our schools, our churches, and other kinds of meeting places where we gather with people that we share common interests with. Community, when we're talking about domestic horror, refers not necessarily to the entire city that we live in. Instead, it refers to places and groups that are important parts of our day-to-day lives. Now, yes, in smaller towns, it might be an entire community. as we see in A Rose for Emily. But in larger cities, it might just be our place of work, a mall, a shopping center, or other business we usually frequent, a recreational area, a subdivision. And of course, it includes the communities of people that we interact with, such as schoolmates or coworkers, circles of friends, of course, or members of organizations we belong to, and naturally, most importantly, our families. Now, Whisker states that in domestic horror, these spaces, especially our homes, are used as symbols of spaces that create horror as well as symbols of the self, as we talked about. As we recall, traditional European Gothic had a fascination with spaces. Harris's handout on elements of the Gothic includes castles, convents, monasteries, and other religious spaces, underground labyrinths, catacombs, and areas like that. Now, Whisker states that domestic horror moves that fascination with spaces into those places that we are most familiar with. Those same feelings of horror that Gothic associates with huge castles become associated with even the smallest one-bedroom apartment. Also, Whisker states that domestic horror often incorporates spaces where we are often most vulnerable because we're relaxed, we're sleeping, or we might be focused on our daily routines. We might even be completely naked. One of the most famous scenes in the history of horror films, of course, is the shower scene in Psycho. And a shower is a great place for horror. It's very small and self-contained. It's an easy place to become trapped because we can't exit in any direction but one, and if that exit is blocked by a murderer, as it is in Psycho, then we can't get out. And of course, nudity always increases our feelings of vulnerability. Now, Whisker also states that domestic horror exposes familiar places as danger zones. And Whisker says that one of the functions of domestic horror is to remind us that familiar spaces might not be as safe as they appear. We've certainly seen this in the U.S. in terms of our classrooms. It used to be that the only thing we had to fear in a classroom was dirty looks from the teacher. But grade schools, high schools, universities, and community colleges have all been sites of mass murders committed by people the victims usually didn't know in recent years. Classrooms are vulnerable spaces. And we have our belongings spread out around us, and we're focused on what is going on in the classroom. Or, we might just be focused on trying to stay awake. But we're not on guard against physical danger, as we might be if, for example, we were walking in an unfamiliar neighborhood by ourselves at night. Often in classrooms, there are no exits other than the door that a gunman might be blocking. There's nothing substantial enough to provide a safe physical barrier in most cases. There's just the small wooden desks. And this is particularly frightening because our classrooms are familiar spaces that are almost like an extension of our homes. But as Whisker points out, spaces that we think are safe can, in fact, be danger zones, and the danger is heightened because we are not on guard at all or prepared for it at all. Well, even spaces that are not all that familiar can be sites of domestic horror. You remember when we saw 1408, Mike Enslin reminds us that all hotel rooms are basically the same, right? As Enslin says, when we walk into a hotel room, even if it's in a city we've never visited before, our reaction is one of recognition. And in practically no time after we get to the room, we've unpacked our bags, surrounded ourselves with familiar objects that we brought with us, slipped into comfy clothes, and stretched out to watch TV. We make what is actually a very generic space our own, and we feel comfortable and familiar with it. So defamiliarizing that space, as we saw happen in 1408, is almost as unsettling and horrific as defamiliarizing our homes. Now, according to Whisker, one particular way that domestic horror works with familiar spaces is by depicting them as entrapments, particularly for women or other vulnerable characters. We've seen this aspect in some of the works we've studied already. In The Yellow Wallpaper, for example, the house is depicted as a space to which the narrator is confined with absolutely no hope of escape. The theme of home as entrapment for women is even more directly depicted in the narrator's hallucinations of women trapped within the wallpaper. In that case, women are actually trapped by a physical part of the house. But it's not only women who can be trapped in the space. Both The Shining and 1408 depict reasonably familiar spaces as entrapments. Because entrapment cuts characters off from society, it produces isolation. And we've already learned from studying the elements of American Gothic, isolation is a frequent theme in American Gothic. Now, Whisker also states that domestic horror often implies or directly demonstrates hidden secrets and hidden selves that are different from the self that we allow the world to see. She states that often these secret and hidden selves are depicted as being necessitated by constrictions within the home environment. Sometimes, but not always, secrets and other selves are hidden because of fear of repercussions from family members if the secrets become known. For example, The Shining reveals that Jack and Wendy fail to have significant discussions because of fear of how the other will react. I think it could be argued that Jack's obsession with the Overlook is an addiction, and maybe one reason he fails to discuss the Overlook's effect on him is that he knows how Wendy reacted to his alcoholism. And that might particularly have been a factor because so many of the little habits that characterized his drinking reappear after the family moves to the Overlook. Of course, Jack's not the only one who keeps secrets, and by the same token, Wendy might resist telling Jack that she's concerned about his relationship with Danny because even she recognizes that at least some of that might spring from a jealousy that's similar to the jealousy that her mother had felt. And as you know, if you're married, no one wants to hear a spouse say, "You're just like your mother," or "You're just like your father." And also in The Shining, we see, of course, that Danny keeps secrets. Primarily, he keeps his shine hidden because he's afraid that he will be put away, particularly after the father of one of his schoolmates is. And he also naturally believes that his parents won't believe him when he says that he sometimes sees what's going to happen in the future. We also saw how community standards prevented young Goodman Brown from discussing his experiences in the woods with anyone, including his wife, Faith. His assumption of widespread sin is so hidden that his resentment and suspicion of the community grows continually until, as it says, his dying hour is doomed. Now, recall that in some cases, domestic horror deals with groups larger than the nuclear family and extends to spaces and relationships within a larger community that is important to the central character. And so consequently, what young Goodman Brown experiences in dealing with members of his community is considered domestic horror. Pardon me. Now, Lister raises an interesting point by discussing that in some ways all of us are to blame for domestic horror in the real world because we're so vested in the American dream of the happy home and family. We actually believe that the happy family in front of the fireplace that's depicted on Christmas cards is not only attainable, but actually the norm. So we hide, even from ourselves, anything that might indicate that our home and family doesn't meet that norm. As a result, some members of the family might feel trapped, or they might feel it's imperative to hide important aspects of ourselves, or to keep secrets. And because we so often associate our homes with our identity, as Whisker has stated we do, a serious critique of home would amount to a serious critique of self. Many, if not most people, try very hard to not see the darker aspects of the self. And honesty about the situations in our home might force us to examine our roles in creating those situations. So we just go along pretending that there's nothing wrong, even though there actually is. And according to Whisker, that's how we all contribute to domestic horror as it exists in the real world. Now, we've already mentioned this a time or two, but domestic horror deals with more than just space. It also deals with family and relationships. And Whisker explains that close relationships are critiqued in stories of entrapment, monstrous parents and children, and skeletons, both literal and figurative, in the closet. A really clear example of that is provided by A Rose for Emily. The obvious horrors of murder and necrophilia were caused at least in part by Emily's peculiar mental condition. But they also were created by the horror that she experiences in dealing with the community around her. As Whisker points out, while isolation can be a source of horror, intrusion can too, especially if the intrusion is excessive or carried out by inappropriate people. Inappropriate and excessive intrusion threatens our feelings of security and safety in our homes, and as we've already talked about, that's a basic need that all humans share. Emily does what she does in the story because, at least in some critics' opinions, and we will talk about that, the town pushes her into doing it. Now, Whisker states that domestic horror that deals with families and relationships often focuses on the oppressive, the threatening, and the perverse. In other words, the other side of the domestic bliss coin. Now, while any community of people that is significant to our lives can be the focus of domestic horror, Whisker says that relationships within immediate families are good subjects for horror because usually they are the relationships that are most significant in reflecting and helping to create our identities. She says that children make good subjects of horror because children represent parents' desire for immortality. We tend to see children to a greater or lesser degree as a reflection of the self. Truly horrible children who commit murders or other atrocities, as most of the children who are sources of horror in fiction tend to do, lead us to question what part of ourselves that aspect of the child's personality arises from, or what we are doing wrong as parents that created an environment that would create such evil. Now, another point that Whisker makes about the people who are important to us and their being sources of horror is that they have even more opportunity to attack us when we are most vulnerable because in many cases they live with us, or at least have access to us when we are in vulnerable states. It's much easier for people we live with to be on hand when we're sleeping or showering. But that doesn't mean they're the only people who have access to it when we're vulnerable. In the film Carrie is first approached by a schoolmate after making an error playing volleyball. And then, of course, she's attacked by a larger community of girls when she is debilitated by confusion and fear and is naked and trapped in a shower. The spaces provide a better opportunity for horror because performance in an athletic venue is much more visible than performance in an academic class. And of course, the nudity and limited exits from a shower lend themselves to entrapment. But it's really the girls, not the spaces themselves, that are the sources of evil that lead to horror. And often, the trust we place in our families can contribute to horror. For example, the narrator in the yellow wallpaper trusts her husband not only as a spouse, but also as a medical expert. Now, there's some debate about literary critics on this topic, but I don't think that John appears to be intentionally hurting his wife. He's using medical judgment that was believed to be sound at the time the story was written. But because the medical knowledge was wrong, the trust was misplaced, and the man that the narrator counts on to relieve her depression and horror instead increases it to the point of madness. Now, and pardon me again, Whisker states that teenagers are very good subjects for domestic horror, and they're often central to domestic horror because they're on a border. And the border divides normality from abnormality. Whisker even compares teenagers to vampires. Vampires are neither alive nor dead, and teenagers are neither children nor adults. Whisker states that the teen years are a liminal space, and liminal is defined as anything that is transitional or related to a border or threshold. As Whisker points out, teens are on the border between the controlled liberties of childhood and the conformities of adulthood. She says that the teen years represent the dangerous borderline that is created from the relatively free reign that is childhood, and the fact that that is in some ways curtailed as society places more pressure on teens to conform and to adhere to rules of society that they might not even be old enough to be aware exist. Also, as Whisker points out, it's a natural part of the teenage years to question authority. We have to do that to define our own value system. A value system that is ours and is not just what is dictated to us by others. That questioning is part of the process we have to go through in order to form a unique individual self. But when you combine the fact that there are societal expectations placed on teenagers, and they're not always even sure of what those expectations are, and they don't feel confident that authority figures can be trusted, well, you can see where the teen years are particularly fraught with stress. And that increases the danger that the decisions that are made and the actions that are taken can move in the wrong direction. Now, as Whisker says, domestic horror, of course, focuses on cases where the directions that are followed are spectacularly wrong and lead to consequences that are, of course, often exaggerated, because horror often does tend to exaggerate in order to create an effect of horror. Now, we see obvious examples of the dangers of the metamorphosis from child to adult going disastrously wrong in Carrie. Also, as we read it, we might want to consider the fact that the incidents in The Other take place the summer after the twins' 13th birthdays. So the twins are also living in the liminal space of the teenage years. Obviously, in both cases, and you will see this in both Carrie and The Other, there are other factors of domestic horror that contribute to what happens. For example, I think after watching it that we'll pretty much all be able to agree that Carrie's mother is not depicted as being loving and nurturing, shall we say. And certainly the girls she goes to school with bully her horribly. But we also have to consider the effects of the dangers of being in that liminal space as a teenager might have had on the horror that we see in those works. Okay, that's all I have to share with you about domestic horror. I hope it helps, and I hope mainly that it reveals some ideas in the works we're studying that make those works even more interesting to you, because that's really what I'm attempting to do when I go over what experts have said about horror literature. If you need any clarification on the information in this video or anything else in the course, you of course can email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.okie@csn.edu. In the meantime, have a really great day. I hope you can get some time to relax and enjoy yourself.